In the spring of 1859, a crowd gathered in a small Missouri town not for a livestock auction, but to inspect 40 children who had just arrived by rail from New York. They were lined up on a wooden platform. Prospective foster parents peered into their mouths, felt their muscles, and made their choices. This was not an outlier. It was national policy. For over 70 years, this was how America solved its orphan problem. This was the orphan train movement. Over 7 decades, nearly 200,000 vulnerable children were shipped west. But here's the brutal truth. Most were not orphans. They were the sons and daughters of desperate immigrants and the poor, removed from city slums to become laborers in unfamiliar homes. They stood on platforms while strangers decided their fate. For every child who found a loving family, countless others vanished into a system that viewed them as free labor. This is the story of one of those children. The engine of this system was desperation, burning at both ends. In New York City, an estimated 30,000 children roamed the streets in the 1850s. They were the children of Irish immigrants fleeing famine, of German families broken by poverty, of mothers who worked 16-hour days in garment factories and fathers who had died in industrial accidents. They slept in alleyways, under staircases, and in packed, squalid tenements that reformers called nurseries of crime. The city saw them as a menace, a rising tide of petty thieves and future felons. The solution, devised by a young minister named Charles Loring Brace, was as simple as it was radical: export them. Brace founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853. He was not a villain in his own mind, but a reformer. He believed the corrupting influence of the city was a disease, and the cure was fresh air, hard work, and Christian family life in the country. His plan was not adoption as we understand it. It was placing out. The society would gather children from streets, orphanages, and destitute parents, put them on trains headed west, and hand them over to whoever would take them. There were no formal applications for foster parents, no home studies, no background checks, just a handbill nailed to a post announcing that a company of homeless children from New York would be available for placement. The first train left in October 1854 with 45 boys sent to Dowagiac, Michigan. The public relations were masterful. Newspapers in the East praised the humanitarian mission, while flyers in the West promised farmers a chance to obtain children for labor. For Brace, it was a benevolent bargain. The child received a home and moral guidance. The farming family received an extra pair of hands. The city was cleansed of a social problem. Everyone won. But the reality on the ground was far murkier, governed by economic need and chance. The children themselves had little say. Some were true orphans. Many were surrendered by parents who were told it was temporary, a chance for their child to be fed and educated. Others were simply picked up off the street. They were scrubbed, given a change of clothes, and put on a train with a tag pinned to their coat. Their journey could last days, in crowded cars, with little understanding of where they were going or why. When they arrived, the spectacle began. They would be taken to a public venue, a church, a town hall, a theater. They were made to stand in a line, often on a stage, while the entire town gathered to look them over. Adults would walk up and down the line asking questions. How old are you? Can you read? Are you strong? They would feel the children's arms for muscle, check their teeth like horses, and look for any sign of weakness or defect. It was a human livestock show. The choosing could be swift and arbitrary. A farmer needed a strong boy for field work. A childless woman might be drawn to the face of a quiet girl. Siblings, promised they would stay together, were routinely separated on the spot if only one was wanted. This is where our story narrows from 200,000 to 1. Her name was Mary. She was 14 years old in the spring of 1878 when she stood on a platform in St. Joseph, Missouri. She had auburn hair, freckles, and a worn tag that read Ward of the Children's Aid Society. Her mother, a widowed seamstress in a New York tenement, had signed a surrender form a month earlier, believing a better life was possible out west. Mary now stood under the gaze of dozens of strangers, her small satchel at her feet. The crowd murmured. A storekeeper with slick-back hair eyed her, then turned to the man next to him and said plainly, "She's small, but she looks quiet. Could use her in the back of the shop." A farm wife with a pinched face reached out and took Mary's hand, turning it over to inspect the palms. "Soft," she declared, and moved on. This was the brutal calculus of the orphan train. You were not chosen for love, you were selected for utility. Then a man stepped forward from the back of the room. He was not like the others. He was older, perhaps 50, with a weathered face half hidden by a thick beard and the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. His coat was heavy, lined with fur, and smelled of pine and cold air. He didn't touch her. He didn't ask to see her teeth. He simply looked at the agent and said, "I'll take her." The agent, a young man from the society, blinked. "You understand the terms. She is to be given proper lodging, sent to school when possible, and treated as a member of the family. You will submit yearly reports." The man in the fur coat gave a single, slow nod. He did not look like a man who filed reports. He reached into his coat, not for money. The children were technically free, but for a folded paper. It was a signed agreement from the local committee, a formality that meant someone in town had vouched for him. The agent hesitated, but a placed child was a success. He made a check on his clipboard. Mary picked up her satchel, her heart a trapped bird in her chest. The man turned and walked out of the hall without a word. She had to hurry to follow. Outside, a wagon waited, hitched to two sturdy mules. He climbed up and nodded to the space beside him. As the wagon rolled out of town, leaving the crowd and the other children behind, Mary dared a glance at her new guardian. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his profile hard as the rocky hills in the distance. He had not asked her name. He had not told her his. The only sound was the creak of leather and the steady clop of hooves on the hard dirt road. They were heading into the deep, snow-dusted mountains, and Mary had no idea if she had just been saved or sentenced. The cabin, when they reached it, was not a home. It was a fortress of solitude, wedged into the side of a mountain where the wind never stopped howling. It was built from dark, rough-hewn logs, with a single window that reflected the gathering dusk like a blind eye. No smoke rose from the chimney. No chickens scratched in the yard. Just endless, silent pines and a sky that was rapidly deepening to a bruise-like purple. Elias, that was his name, she would learn, stepped down from the wagon and walked to the door without a backward glance. Mary clutched her satchel, the cold seeping through her thin coat, and followed. Inside was a single room, dominated by a stone fireplace cold and black with old ash. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall, a rough wooden table and two stools against another. Shelves held tin plates, a few tools, and sacks of dried beans and flour. There were no curtains, no rugs, no signs of a woman or a child ever having lived there. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, leather, and something else, a deep, lonely silence. Elias lit a lantern, its glow carving hollows in his cheeks. He nodded toward a pile of furs in the corner near the fire. "You sleep there." Then he turned to the fireplace, crouching to build a fire with practiced, silent efficiency. Mary did not sleep that night. She lay on the furs, watching the firelight dance on the log ceiling, listening to the wind claw at the corners of the cabin, and to the steady, heavy breaths of the man sleeping across the room. She was 14, alone in the wilderness with a stranger, and the full weight of what had happened pressed down on her. She was not a daughter. She was a transaction, a piece of paperwork that had been transferred from one ledger to another. The tears came then, hot and silent, soaking into the coarse fur. Morning brought a brutal clarity. Elias was already outside when she woke. She found him by the woodpile splitting logs with a rhythmic, powerful swing of his axe. He did not greet her. He simply pointed with his chin toward the cabin. On the table was a tin cup of water and a piece of hardtack biscuit, her breakfast. Her instructions were unspoken but clear. She was to stay inside, stay out of the way. This was the pattern of the next week. Elias would leave at dawn to trap or hunt. Mary would sit by the cold fireplace, waiting, trying to decipher the rules of this silent, stark world. He would return at dusk, sometimes with a rabbit or a grouse, prepare a meager stew, and they would eat in wordless company. He asked nothing of her. He demanded no labor. This, in its own way, was more terrifying than cruelty. She was a ghost in his house. But the system that placed her here was not designed for idle ghosts. The agreement signed in St. Joseph stipulated she was to be useful, to earn her keep through labor. Elias was violating the contract simply by ignoring her. And Mary, trained by a life of poverty to read the moods of adults, began to see something else in his silence. It wasn't malice. It was a profound, entrenched avoidance. He looked through her, as if seeing someone else, and the pain of that vision was too much to bear. The first crack in the ice came on the 8th day. A late spring snowstorm blew in, trapping them inside. Elias sat at the table, painstakingly repairing a torn leather bridle. Mary, driven by a desperate need to be something other than a piece of furniture, noticed his stitching was clumsy, the leather puckering. Her mother had been a seamstress. Mary had been threading needles and reinforcing seams since she was 6. Without a word, she walked over, took the bridle and the bone needle from his hands. He stiffened but did not stop her. Her small hands moved with a speed and precision his large, scarred ones could not match. In 10 minutes, the repair was neat and strong. She handed it back. Elias stared at the stitching, then at her hands, then at her face for a long, silent moment. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not thanks, it was an acknowledgement. She existed. The next morning, he did not go out. Instead, he gestured for her to follow him to a small, dilapidated shed behind the cabin. Inside, covered in dust and cobwebs, was a spinning wheel and a small loom. "My wife's," he said, the first voluntary words he'd spoken about his past. His voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together. "Might be you can use them." He left her there. Mary cleaned the equipment with a reverence she didn't fully understand. That afternoon, she found a sack of raw, matted wool in a corner. She spent hours carding it, the repetitive motions soothing her nerves. When Elias returned, she had a small, lumpy ball of spun yarn. He looked at it, and something in his eyes shifted, like a cloud passing from the sun. A fragile routine began. Mary would cook the simple meals, beans, biscuits, stew. She began to clean not just her corner, but the entire cabin, beating the furs, scrubbing the soot from the hearthstone. Elias continued his silent work, but now he began to leave things for her. A carved wooden spoon one day, a patched wool blanket the next. Once he came back with a small jar of wild honey and set it wordlessly next to her plate. It was a language without words, a grammar of small, careful gestures. Then one afternoon, while exploring the edge of the clearing, Mary found it. A small, fenced plot of land, 20 paces from the cabin, not a garden. The ground was too neatly kept, free of pine needles, and in the center, a simple wooden cross made from 2 branches lashed together with twine. No name, no dates, just the cross and the overwhelming sense of a silence deeper than any she had known in the cabin. She backed away, her heart hammering. When Elias returned, she was waiting by the table. She pointed out the window toward the clearing. "Who is buried there?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias stopped as if struck. All the color drained from his weathered face. He didn't speak for a full minute, his eyes locked on that distant, unseen plot. "My daughter," he finally said, the words torn from somewhere deep and raw. "Eliza, she was 8. The fever took her, my wife. She couldn't stay after. Said the mountains had taken everything but her breath. She left the next spring." He turned his gaze to Mary, and for the first time he really saw her, not as a ghost, not as a reminder, but as a person sitting in his kitchen. "You have her hands," he said, almost to himself. "The way they move." That night, the dynamic in the cabin irrevocably changed. The unspoken tragedy that filled the space between them had been named. Mary understood, with a shock of clarity, why he had chosen her from that line in St. Joseph. It wasn't for labor. It was a grief-stricken, desperate impulse from a man haunted by a ghost, and she understood her own terrifying new role. She was both a replacement and a stranger, a potential salvation and a living wound. Weeks turned into a month. The mountain spring finally arrived, timid and green. Mary, emboldened by the fragile understanding, asked for seeds. Elias returned from his next trip to a distant trading post with a small, precious packet of carrot and bean seeds. Together, but mostly in silence, they cleared a small patch of rocky soil near the cabin. This was not the grand, fertile plains promised by the Orphan train pamphlets. This was a fight for every inch of growth. But as Mary pressed the seeds into the cold earth, she felt a thread of connection to the land, to this man, to a future that was no longer just about survival. It was around this time that the outside world, which they had both shut out, came knocking. A neighbor, if you could call a man who lived 2 valleys over a neighbor, stopped by. His name was Clay, a trapper with a lean, hungry look. He'd heard through the whisper network of the mountains that Elias had taken in an orphan train kid. He eyed Mary with open curiosity as she carried water from the stream. "Heard they send out inspectors," Clay said to Elias, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "From that Children's Aid Society. Make sure the placements are suitable." He let the word hang in the air. A man living alone with a young girl. Folks in town might start to talk, Elias, might start to wonder about the terms of your agreement. Elias' face, which had begun to soften in recent weeks, closed up like a trap. "The terms are my business," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Clay shrugged, a nasty smile playing on his lips, just saying, "The system has eyes and tongues." He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving a new and chilling kind of silence behind him. The threat was now out in the open. Their fragile peace had an expiration date. Someone somewhere had the power to undo it all. The system that had brought Mary here could just as easily take her away, declaring this isolated mountain cabin an unsuitable home. Elias stood on the porch, watching Clay disappear into the trees, his jaw set like iron. Mary stood in the doorway, the water bucket heavy in her hand. The unspoken question hung between them, colder than the mountain's stream. Had they built something only for it to be taken away by the very people who had sent her here? The inspector arrived on a Tuesday. His name was Mr. Finley, and he rode into the clearing on a tidy bay horse, his suit a stark black smudge against the green pines. He carried a leather satchel and an air of detached authority. Elias met him on the porch, blocking the doorway with his body. Mary watched from the window, her hands clenched in the folds of her apron. "Mr. Thatcher, I am Jeremiah Finley, agent for the Children's Aid Society's Western Placement Review." He did not offer a hand. "I'm here for the annual welfare check on the minor, Mary Connolly, standard procedure." He produced a paper from his satchel. Elias did not move to take it. "She's well," he said, his voice a low growl. "I shall need to see her, speak with her, and inspect her living conditions, per the terms you agreed to in St. Joseph." Finley's eyes scanned the cabin, the woodpile, the barren yard. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze was a measuring tape, calculating value and finding deficit. Reluctantly, Elias stepped aside. Mary was made to stand in the center of the room while Finley asked questions. Was she fed regularly? Was she struck or punished? Was she allowed to read? Did she attend church or school? Mary answered in quiet monosyllables, feeling like a specimen under glass. Finley then inspected the cabin. He noted the absence of a proper bed for her, the furs. He noted the lack of books. He peered into the nearly empty flour sack. He stood for a long time looking at the small, struggling garden plot. "The agreement emphasizes the child's education and moral uplift through integration into a family unit," he said, turning to Elias. "This appears to be a solitary subsistence homestead. Where is the family unit, Mr. Thatcher?" Elias' knuckles were white where he gripped the door frame. "She is part of this unit." Finley made a note in his ledger. "I see one adult male and one minor female in conditions of significant isolation. The Society's mandate is to place children in wholesome, Christian family settings, preferably with two parents or at the very least within a community context for socialization. This does not meet the standard benchmarks." He closed his ledger with a soft, final snap. "I will be filing my report. A recommendation will be made. You will receive word by post." He tipped his hat, a meaningless courtesy, and rode away. The silence he left behind was heavier than any mountain snow. The system had flexed its muscle. It had seen their life and found it wanting. The threat was no longer abstract gossip. It was a bureaucratic decree written in ink and headed to New York. Panic, cold and sharp, settled in the cabin. Elias became a man possessed. He began a furious, pointless campaign to transform their existence into something the society would approve. He built a proper rope bed for Mary, hauling the materials from a mill 2 days' ride away. He bought a battered primer and a Bible from the trading post and insisted Mary read aloud each night, though neither of them found comfort in the words. He even spoke to the distant pastor in the valley town about Sunday services, a prospect that filled him with visible dread. They were performing, and both knew it. They were building a stage set of a respectable life, and the strain was tearing at the fragile trust they'd built. Mary, for her part, began to withdraw. The inspection had reduced her to a problem to be solved, a checklist item. She felt her presence was now a source of danger to Elias, to this hard-won peace. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she whispered the fear that had been gnawing at her. "Maybe I should go, before they make you send me away. I could find work somewhere." Elias looked at her, and for the first time she saw raw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. "No," he said, the word absolute. "This is your home, I will fix this." But his voice lacked its usual granite certainty. He didn't know how to fight an enemy made of paper and policy. The breaking point came with the letter. It arrived a month later, delivered by a mail rider. It was on official Children's Aid Society letterhead. It stated that, based on Agent Finley's report, the placement of Mary Connolly with Elias Thatcher was deemed suboptimal and not in full alignment with the Society's placement standards. It did not order an immediate removal. Instead, it announced that a final review would be conducted in 6 weeks' time by a senior placement officer. The officer would interview Mary privately and make a final determination on the suitability of the home. The letter emphasized the Society's in loco parentis authority, its legal standing as her guardian. The implication was clear: this was their last chance. But here is where the story twists. The letter held a second piece of information, one that sent a different, more ancient chill down Mary's spine. The senior officer conducting the review would be a Mrs. Abigail Grier, and in a postscript, Finley had handwritten a note. Mrs. Grier was particularly noted for her success in reuniting placed children with their found-birth parents, when such a reunion is deemed in the child's best interest. Birth parents, Mary's mother, the woman who had signed the papers in a moment of despair. The system now dangled a new, terrifying possibility. What if they weren't just going to move her to another farm? What if they intended to send her back to the tenement, to the desperate poverty her mother could not escape, to undo the entire journey? For Mary, the thought of returning to that life was somehow more frightening than being placed with another stern farmer. Here, she had become someone. There, she would be a burden once again. Elias saw the new fear in her eyes. "What is it?" he asked. She pointed to the postscript. He read it and his face darkened into a storm. "No," he said, "but this time it was a vow. They will not take you from this mountain, not to another placement, and sure as hell not back to a life that already failed you once." The fight had just become existential. It was no longer about meeting standards. It was about defying the very authority that had created their situation. The following week, Elias did something he had never done before. He went to town, not for supplies, but for a meeting. He sought out the circuit judge who passed through the valley every few months, a man named Keller. In a back room of the saloon, Elias laid out the situation. He asked point blank what legal rights he had. Judge Keller, an old man with whiskey on his breath and sharp eyes, listened. Then he delivered the crushing truth. "Elias, you have no rights. You are not her kin. You have no formal adoption papers. You have a charitable placement contract with the Children's Aid Society. They hold all the cards. If they decide to remove her, the law will stand with them. Your only chance is to convince this Mrs. Grier that this is, in fact, the best place for the girl. Sentiment don't weigh much in these matters, but if you can show stability, maybe." It was the maybe that hung in the air, a slim, brittle thread of hope. Elias returned to the cabin with a grim determination. They had 6 weeks. They would not just perform anymore, they would prove. Mary threw herself into the garden, which was now showing stubborn green shoots. She began knitting a blanket from the wool she'd spun, something tangible to show industry. Elias, meanwhile, embarked on the most unlikely project of all. He began building a proper room onto the cabin. A room with a real window for Mary. It was a physical declaration, an investment in a future. Every swing of his hammer was a word in his defense. But the mountain had its own trials. A week before Mrs. Grier was due, an early autumn blizzard swept down from the peaks, a brutal reminder of nature's indifference to human deadlines. It snowed for 2 days straight, burying the cabin, blocking the pass to the valley. They were cut off. If the inspector couldn't reach them, would it be seen as an act of God, or as negligence on Elias' part for living in such an inaccessible place? The storm passed, leaving a world of blinding white and deep, impassable drifts. Elias looked at the blocked trail, then at Mary. "We'll dig out," he said. "We'll meet her at the fork in the road if we have to." For 3 days, they took turns shoveling a path through chest-high snow, their breath plumbing in the frozen air, their muscles burning with exhaustion. It was a desperate physical testament to their will to stay together. On the morning of the inspection, a path was cleared, just wide enough for a horse. They stood at the edge of the property, waiting. The world was silent, expectant. And then in the distance, a sleigh appeared, pulled by a single horse cutting through the white expanse. Mrs. Abigail Grier had arrived. She was not what they expected. She was not a stern matron, but a sharp-faced woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She took in the shoveled path, the smoke from the chimney, the two figures standing together in the cold. She did not smile. She simply stepped down from the sleigh, her boots sinking into the snow, and looked from Elias to Mary. "Shall we begin?" she said. Her voice was calm, professional, and utterly inscrutable. The final judgment had come to their doorstep, and now they would have to face it together. The inspection that followed was not like Finley's. Mrs. Grier did not make notes. She observed. She walked through the shoveled path to the cabin, her gaze taking in the new room addition, its raw timber still pale against the old logs. She stepped inside, feeling the warmth from the fire, noting the neat shelves, the clean floor, the new bed with its knitted blanket. She asked Mary to show her the garden. Mary led her to the snow-dusted plot, pointing out the shapes of the dormant carrots and beans beneath the white blanket. "We dug the rows together," Mary said, her voice firmer than she felt. Back inside, Mrs. Grier requested a private word with Mary. Elias stepped outside into the cold, his shoulders rigid with tension. Mrs. Grier did not sit. She stood by the fireplace and looked at Mary. "Tell me, child, not what you think I want to hear, the truth. Are you afraid here?" Mary thought of the long silence, the grave in the clearing, the howling wind, and the man who had built her a room with his own hands. "No," she said, "I am not afraid." "Are you lonely?" Mary thought of the long days of quiet work, of shared meals without conversation that were no longer uncomfortable. "I was lonelier in a room with 40 other children," she said. "Here, the quiet has a shape. I understand it." Mrs. Grier's eyes softened just a fraction. "The report states this is an unsuitable isolation, that you lack education, community, and the influence of a mother. How do you answer that?" Mary took a deep breath. She walked to the shelf and took down the primer and the Bible. She opened the primer to a page she had practiced. "I can read," she said, and read a paragraph flawlessly. She closed the book. "Elias taught me to track, to tan a hide, to tell which clouds mean snow. I taught myself to knit and spin from his wife's wheel. My mother in New York taught me to mend and to be quiet. I have had many teachers, and a mother is the person who stays." Her voice caught on the last word, but she did not look away. Mrs. Grier was silent for a long moment. Then she asked the final, crucial question. "If the society decided another placement, with a family in a town, with a school and a church and other children, was in your best interest, would you go?" Mary did not hesitate. "This is my home, he is my family. The law may not see it, but we know it. If you take me from here, you will not be moving me to a better place. You will be making me an orphan all over again." Mrs. Grier nodded slowly. She called Elias back in. He stood just inside the door, a statue of apprehension. "Mr. Thatcher," she began, her voice formal again, "the conditions here are undeniably austere and isolated. By every standard metric of the Children's Aid Society, this placement is a failure." Elias flinched as if struck. Mary felt the world drop away, but Mrs. Grier continued. "However, my duty is not to metrics, but to the child's welfare. I have interviewed over 300 placed children. I have seen the successful placements, the children who call their new parents mother and father and thrive. And I have seen the failures, the children who are worked like beasts, who are beaten, who run away, whose spirits are broken. I look for one thing, attachment, a mutual bond that serves as the child's anchor." She turned to Mary. "This child is anchored here," she turned to Elias. "And you, sir, for all your silence and your solitary ways, are anchored to her. I see it in the room you built. I saw it in the path you shoveled through a mountain of snow. The society's goal is a Christian family life. You have built a family. It is an unusual one, but it is no less real." From her satchel she produced a document. "This is a revised guardianship agreement. It transitions Mary from a placed child under yearly review to permanent ward in your legal guardianship until she reaches the age of 18. It requires your signature and the signature of a witness, which I will provide. It also requires that you make provisions for her formal education, either through correspondence courses or a tutor, if one can be found. Do you agree to these terms?" Elias could not speak. He simply nodded, his eyes bright with a sheen of moisture. He took the pen she offered and signed his name with slow, deliberate strokes. Mrs. Grier signed as witness. She handed one copy to Elias, placed the other in her satchel. "The society will close its file. She is your responsibility now, in the eyes of the law, and I believe, in your heart. See that you do not fail her." With that, she left. They stood in the cabin, listening to the sleigh bells fade into the distance. The silence that descended was different. It was not the silence of uncertainty or dread. It was the profound, peaceful silence of a reprieve. They had won. The The system had looked at their imperfect, cobbled-together family and for once had seen its value. The following years were not a fairy tale. They were hard mountain years. Elias honored his promise about education, trading furs for a set of correspondence lessons from a school in St. Louis. Mary would work on them by lantern light, Elias puzzling over the mathematics alongside her, both of them learning together. The garden grew larger. Mary, now 16, took over the management of a small flock of sheep, using the wool to produce mittens and socks that Elias would trade. The cabin lost its edge of stark survival and gained the patina of a lived-in home, curtains Mary sewed, shelves full of her books, the smell of bread baking regularly. When Mary was 17, a letter arrived from New York. It was from a charity sister writing on behalf of Mary's mother. Her mother was ill. The letter did not ask for Mary to return. There was no money for that. It simply conveyed a mother's regret and a hope that her daughter was well. Mary read the letter aloud to Elias, her voice trembling. When she finished, he said, "We have money from the last furs, enough for a train ticket east and back." He took her to New York. The journey was a reverse Orphan train route, but this time she was not a commodity in a rail car. She was a young woman with a guardian. They found her mother in a tenement not unlike the one she'd left, frail and worn thin by years of labor. The reunion was bittersweet, filled with tears and apologies and the unbridgeable gap created by time and distance. Mary saw the life she had escaped. Before they left, Elias, without discussion, pressed a roll of banknotes into her mother's hand. "For a doctor," he said, it was more words than he'd spoken to anyone else in days. On the train back west, Mary looked out at the passing prairie, the same land she had crossed as a frightened child. "Thank you," she said to Elias. He didn't ask for what. He just placed his hand over hers, a rough, warm weight, and left it there. Mary turned 18. The guardianship papers expired, but the bond did not. She stayed. The mountain was her home. She became known in the valley town not as an orphan train kid, but as Mary Thatcher. People forgot she wasn't his by blood. One spring when she was 22, a railroad surveyor came to the valley, just as in the original story. He offered Elias a significant sum for a right-of-way through his land. Elias refused. That evening, he and Mary walked their property line. At the edge of the road, they posted a sign, carved and painted by Mary. It read, "Not for sale." The years turned. Elias grew older, his beard gone fully white. Mary never married. The cabin was her world. She became a midwife and a herbalist for the scattered mountain families, using the skills she'd honed in isolation to serve a community. The story of the orphan girl and the mountain man became a local legend, a testament to an unlikely loyalty. Elias passed away quietly in his sleep one winter night. Mary buried him next to his daughter, Eliza, in the clearing. On his headstone, she carved only his name and the dates, and beneath it, he learned to love again. She continued to live in the cabin, tending the garden that now seemed to flourish with a memory of its own. The surprising detail came decades later, when a historian researching the orphan trains found a discrepancy in the records. A file marked Mary Connolly, placed 1878, had a final note added in 1885 in the meticulous hand of Abigail Grier. It read, "Case closed, placement succeeded beyond all metric, child secured permanent family. Note, visited in 1884, found a young woman of remarkable character running a prosperous homestead." The Guardian, when asked if he ever regretted taking in a stranger's child, said, "I didn't take in a stranger, I brought my daughter home." The system that had treated children as human currency had, in this one rare instance, yielded a story of redemption not because of its design, but in spite of it. Mary lived into her 90s, a fixture of the mountain. When she died, she was buried next to Elias and Eliza. The cabin slowly surrendered to the elements, but the garden, gone wild, continued to push through the mountain soil each spring, raspberries by the foundation, mint near the stream, and a single stubborn apple tree that bore fruit long after the people who planted it were gone. The sign by the road, weathered and gray, finally fell. But for those who knew the story, the message remained. Some bonds, forged in the most unlikely of fires, are not for sale. The orphan train movement officially ended in 1929, amid growing criticism and the rise of modern, regulated foster care. The last train rolled to its final stop, and an era closed. In the end, the program had relocated nearly 200,000 children. The historical verdict is mixed. It was born from a genuine, if flawed, humanitarian impulse to save children from the horrors of the street. But it was also a system that commodified human beings, that separated siblings, that placed children with strangers based on a glance and a handshake, with consequences that echoed for generations. For every story like Mary and Elia's, a story of quiet, earned love, there were countless others that held no such redemption. Children who were treated as free labor, worked from dawn until dusk. Children who were abused, neglected, or simply unloved. Children who never stopped feeling like outsiders, who carried the label trained child like a scar. The system's great failure was its inconsistency. It offered a lottery ticket, not a guarantee. Your future depended entirely on the character of the stranger who chose you from the line. So what are we to make of Mary's story? It is not a vindication of the system, but a testament to the human capacity for connection that can, sometimes, bloom even in the most barren and bureaucratic soil. It reminds us that family is not always a matter of blood or legal paperwork, but of daily choice, of showing up, of building a room for someone, of shoveling a path through the snow. Charles Loring Brace's fundamental idea that children are better off in families than in institutions was correct. It remains the cornerstone of child welfare philosophy today, but the tragic flaw was in the execution. The lack of oversight, the failure to protect, the presumption that any home in the country was better than the city. We are still grappling with the echoes of that flaw in our modern foster care systems, still striving to balance the need for safe homes with the right of every child to be seen as an individual, not a solution to a social problem. The mountains where Mary and Elias made their home are quieter now. The cabin is gone, but if you know where to look, you can still find the foundation stones being slowly reclaimed by the earth. And in the spring, if you walk through that clearing, you might still find a few hardy wild raspberries growing, descendants of the garden she tended. That is the final, quiet lesson of this story. We build systems, we write policies, we make grand plans to solve human suffering. But in the end, the most enduring changes are often the small, fragile ones, tended by hand, defended against the cold, and chosen day after day against all odds. These are the stories that history books often overlook, the private victories, the bonds that official paperwork could never capture. If you want to uncover more forgotten histories like this one, stories of resilience hidden in the shadows of our past, make sure to subscribe. Your support helps us keep digging. Thanks.